The title of the book is In This Economy with a question mark. The author, Kyla Scanlon, subtitles her 277-page effort, How Money and Markets Really Work. Ms. Scanlon is a 27-year-old graduate of Western Kentucky University in Bowling Green. The author description in the back of the book says Kyla Scanlon is a writer and a video creator focused on human-centric economic analysis that demystifies complexity and provides context behind the headlines. The author background note continues, she is the founder of the financial education company called Bread. Kyla Scanlon, what's this thing called Vibe Session?
Yeah, so the vibe session is an idea that I came up with about 2 years ago to describe the disconnect between consumer sentiment and economic data. And it was basically meant to talk about this idea that people felt really bad despite the economic data saying that things were relatively okay. And so I published the first piece on it in July of 2022, just pointing out that consumer sentiment was quite low, even though GDP was high, inflation was going down, the labor market was quite strong. The word really took off like a couple months ago, and it's kind of, bigger than I am at this point, and a lot of people are using it, and maybe the context it wasn't originally intended. But it's been exciting to see it rise, mostly because I think it's really important that we talk about how people feel about the economy, as well as how we talk about, the economy performing.
When I read about you, other places it says you're 27. Is that still true?
It is still true, yes.
The reason I bring it up is, I'm a silent generation person, way, way beyond you. And how does somebody your age write this intricate book on the economy? How'd you get there?
I got there through other people, mostly. A lot of people believing in me. When I was in school in Kentucky, I went to Western Kentucky University. I had two professors, Dr. Chachi and Dr. Lebedinsky, who were just phenomenal and let me do all sorts of economic research. And then when I graduated, I was associate over at Capital Group, had a lot of mentorship there. And even now, there's people I can ask a bunch of questions to. Derek Thompson over the Atlantic has been incredibly supportive. Dave Nadig, who used to work at ETF Trends, the Ritz-Holtz gang, who runs a big asset manager. So basically, you write a book with a community. And so that's how it's happened.
I want to localize it. Western Kentucky University. I got on and looked up some numbers, and I want you to do the money thing. Tell me why this is the way it is, because you talk about education.
Yeah.
You have about 16,000 students in your old school. The president makes $450,000 a year. There's probably a bonus somewhere in there, but it doesn't say anything about it. The football coach makes $900,000. And the basketball coach made $650,000 because I guess they won some games and got in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah.
You talk about the difficulty in education. And this is just one of many universities, why are they paying those people, especially the sports guys, so much money?
I mean, I think that's what you see at most universities. Western Kentucky is microscopic compared to the salaries that people at Big Ten schools make. I mean, what I've heard and what I've read in my research is that because the football teams and the basketball teams tend to bring in so much revenue for the schools, they get paid a lot. And so I don't think it's great. I think that college has sort of morphed into sports with education attached, when really it should be education with sports attached if sports are included. And I think it does a disservice to students at the end of the day as well, just that unequal distribution of resources. But that seems to be the reason why. Apparently the revenue generation is quite impressive.
You say you're fascinated by Doomerism.
Yes.
What is it?
Yeah. Doomerism it was much more popular about a year ago when the election wasn't in the news so much. And now there's all sorts of other stuff in the news. But Doomerism is this idea that everything is just going very poorly. A lot of people will say that the world is ending all of the time. And especially in finance, which is a world that I spend a lot of time in, Doomerism will be people who are bears. So they expect the stock market to go down, or they expect certain companies to collapse. And that tends to be the driving force of Doomerism. There's a lot of other concepts that tie into it, but really it's that pessimism and that stock market disconnection.
How much are you doing on the internet on a daily basis?
How much time am I spending on the internet, or how much am I working on the internet?
No, I mean, how much do you use it
So my job,
for your work?
yeah. So my job is social media, and so I'm on the internet quite a bit, posting and trying to figure out what's going on. I try to read a lot, so literature, research papers. I'm in a lot of different meetings, and I travel quite a bit right now. So I'd say probably half my day is on the internet, and the other half is with books or with people.
What's the difference if you don't use social media at all and somebody, I assume your age and a lot of your friends and people you work with use it? What's the difference in that world that the two different people live in?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of people who use it for work and then people who use it for leisure, is that what you mean?
Or people who never use it at all and still live in the old world of, and you're looking at somebody that
Yeah.
reads a hard copy newspaper, and doesn't have a Instagram account and doesn't do Twitter and all that stuff. But what do you find is the difference in what's happened to people that are on social media?
Yeah, so my boyfriend actually it doesn't use social media at all. So I kind of have a natural experiment in my house where one of us is, the whole job is social media, then the other doesn't use it at all. And there tends to be less groupthink, there tends to be less tendency towards doomerism. And I would say just in general, people who don't use social media tend to escape some of the trend chasing that happens, some of the memification of ideas. Like a lot of people will start to incorporate internet speak into the way that they talk, sort of lingo, things like that. But I think a lot of people are actually becoming like you and my boyfriend, and choosing to spend less time on social media. You're starting to see a lot of brands go toward print. Like The Atlantic, for example, is expanding their print magazine again. You're seeing companies like Back Market begin to refurbish old iPhones. So people are trying to get away from that trend cycle. And so I say there's definitely a big difference in there's this big psychological difference for people who use social media and those who don't. But I think there's also going to be a consumer difference moving forward as well.
You have 20 chapters in your book, but you have over 200 line items. And some of it's obvious. But when you were writing this book, who do you want to read it?
So the book is really meant for anybody who wants to understand the economy, but who I make content primarily for is people between like 18 to 40 years old who live outside of the world of finance and economics and want to understand it a little bit deeper. Maybe they work in tech, maybe they work in marketing, maybe they're a teacher. And it's really meant to be a fun guide to understanding economics. There's over 60 illustrations. I try to incorporate a lot of literature, a lot of poetry, really just make it not a textbook. And yeah, it's really for anybody who wants to understand economics, but that tends to be the target audience that I have in mind when talking about it.
Since the book's been out, it's been out, what, 6 months or so?
Since May 28th, yes.
What is the most reaction you're getting about anything in the book?
So the biggest reaction to the book so far has just been a lot of excitement about an accessible guide to finance and economics. That's been a lot of my work on social media, is just making economics and finance accessible. And I think I've achieved that with the book. That tends to be the feedback so far. I made a couple mistakes in the book too. So a lot of people tell me about that, and rightly so. They've all been fixed in the second edition. But yeah, it's been really wonderful feedback, and it's been a good learning opportunity for me.
Give me an idea what mistakes you made.
I made a
And
mistake
you
on
corrected.
page 6 about the dollar and just dollar economics. Yeah.
So your day job, what do you work full time for anybody?
No, I'm an independent worker. I own my own company, so I do quite a bit of consulting. I do quite a bit of media projects. I work with Bloomberg Opinion, the Academy of Arts and Sciences. I talk a lot at various schools and conferences. So I'm headed to MIT and Notre Dame over the next few weeks to give some talks there. I've spoken at Harvard, Berkeley, and several conferences, which has been so fun. But I do social media pretty much full time and do all of the speaking stuff and the consulting stuff as well.
This is a podcast about a book, and we're recording this right before the election, and it will run after the election. So at this stage, we have absolutely no idea who's going to win. And I bring that up only to ask you, what will the difference be when it comes to money if one or the other is elected?
Yeah, no, that's so interesting that it'll be released after the election because it's so uncertain. I don't think anybody really knows what's going to happen. I mean, I think the biggest thing is the difference in economic proposals. So President Trump has proposed, blanket tariffs, which are a tax on consumers. And there's plenty of research pointing out that that is probably not the best path to take forward economically. It'll be harmful for families. It'll be harmful for the everyday person. And Vice President Harris has her own set of economic policy proposals, building 3 million more homes, expanding Medicare. So there's support for seniors for in-home care, both of which are expensive. I think the biggest problem with both sets of economic policy proposals is nobody's talking about exactly how we're going to pay for everything. And that just tends to be the campaign process, as you say, a lot of hopeful things, and then hopefully figure out the money later on. But I would say that so far, based on what the proposals are, tariffs are not something that any economist would say is a good idea, especially blanket tariffs. Targeted tariffs are okay, but blanket, not so much. And then the massive expansion of state-run programs has to be financed somehow, and there's not a lot of answers around that.
So during the campaign, when he would say, we're going to have this tariff or that tariff, he'd get cheers from his audience. Just because of this book, with all the definition in it, do you think the people that were listening have any idea of what tariffs are and what they do?
No, and especially when you're being lied
to.
They're being lied to about what they are. There's a confusion. On surface level, it seems like, oh, this is going to be something the companies are going to have to pay for, especially the companies that are trying to, import products into the United States, and that's never the case. Like that cost does get passed on to you and I, the consumer. And so I think a lot of people just don't know that would be how it would end up working, especially for a blanket 10% tariff, and how highly inflationary that would be. I think if people truly understood that, there'd be no cheers in the crowd just because of the pain of inflation that we've had over the past several years. I don't think anyone wants more of that.
What about on the other side when Kamala Harris would say $25,000 for a small business?
Yeah.
Reaction? What is your reaction when you hear that?
So I think that there's always a need for some sort of support for starting up small businesses. And I know she has a similar policy for home buyers as well. And I think it's an important thing to consider as we think about how do we give more Americans entrepreneurship opportunities. But again, as I said earlier, how do you pay for these things? I think that's a big concern about some policies proposed by her. Is how do you finance it? Yeah.
But by the way, how do you pay for these things? We're $35.7 trillion in debt. Does that not matter? You talk about the why the dollar is the best of the lot when you talk about money.
Yes. Yeah, no, still is. The United States is still, as of right now, the strongest country. I think our polarization could put some of that at risk. But debt's interesting because as long as it's productive, it's okay to continue expanding debt because it'll pay for itself in the long run, right? Like if we build more infrastructure, if we invest more in education and training, like that'll pay. But if right now the issue with the government debt is because the Federal Reserve was raising interest rates for so long, rates are quite high. And that means that rates are high on everything, including financing government debt. And so an increasing amount of money is going towards paying interest payments on government debt. And that is not how we want government debt to be used. And so I'd say that's like the most concerning thing, is that it's being used unproductively, and certainly don't want that. And there has to probably be a point where we pull back on spending and say, okay, we don't need to, keep on passing all these bills. We really should think more conservatively. We have to think of the future. And I'm not sure when that will be.
What will make that happen? What do you think has to be triggered in order to stop spending and start saving?
I don't know. I mean, you would think that the closer that we get to defaulting on the, not defaulting, but the debt ceiling situation that happens so often, right? That's probably a good impetus for thinking about spending down the debt, but it doesn't seem to be quite the trigger. The U.S. debt was downgraded a few years ago. You would think that would be a conversation point, but it's just politically quite unpopular. It's really hard to get elected and be like, I'm going to not spend money. So it's kind of a design of the political system, and perhaps that has to change. I'm not sure. If I knew, I'd be working on it.
You say there are 170 countries, there are about 200 countries in the world. 170 of them have a VAT. And when you go overseas, that's the first thing you hear about. 18% VAT there, 20% here. What the heck is a VAT? And why don't we have one here?
Yeah, VAT is a value-added tax. And I think the United States just thinks about taxation a little bit differently. And so we just have chosen not to have it. I think that there could be a definite conversation around expanding taxes in the US, but again, quite politically unpopular, unfortunately. And we're going to have to just look at the tax system a little bit closer.
You talk about transportation and the need for people to have better transportation in order to generate wealth and go to their jobs. But in New York City right now, 50% of the people do not pay to ride the buses. In Washington, D.C., that number is 70%. What does that say about us?
Is that because they're on a
how would
government?
You solve that problem?
Is that because they're on a government program where they get free transportation?
No, it's because they just don't pay. They either, when the back of the bus opens up, they get on and they don't challenge them, or they walk right by the meters. And by the way, in Washington, D.C. right now, they're $750 million short of enough money to run the metro system.
Yeah.
So if you look at all this stuff individually, where's the money going to come from?
Well, there was the congestion pricing tax that was taken out of line a few months ago by the governor of New York, I believe. And that would have helped finance some parts of the metro and probably would have helped build up. There's different fare gates that you can use, specifically with the subway, where I believe you're referring to turnstile hoppers, people that hop over the turnstile and don't pay. I also think the police are down there catching people, which I'm not sure. It would probably just make a little bit more sense to build better turnstiles and perhaps enforcement on the bus. But in terms of paying that, it is taxation, as we were talking about. Congestion taxes are potentially a pretty good thing for New York because of the strength of their transportation system. You don't really need to be in the middle of Manhattan at 2 p.m. in a car unless you're driving a truck, and that's a different story. And I believe they're exempted from that tax, or there's some sort of way to get around it. So that would be the way to finance improvements in transportation.
Where do you live, and why do you live there?
I live in a couple of different places. I spend a lot of time in New York. I spend a lot of time in California. I spend a lot of time in Kentucky. And I do those three places because one, I'm from there, Kentucky. And then the other two is where a lot of my work is. And I have to go there quite a bit to do various projects.
What have you found over the last couple of years? What year did you graduate from Western Kentucky?
2019. Yeah.
Yeah, not very long ago.
No.
What have you found that works for you? In other words, there's been a spark along the way in you having this kind of visibility and being able to write a book. It's just not normal. So what was how'd you do it?
So I wrote about the vibe session, and then I ended up getting a New York Times op-ed out of that paper that I wrote. And so the New York Times piece did quite well. And then Penguin Random House approached me and was like, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I love writing. It's something I've been doing for a very long time. I kept an options trading blog when I was in college and have just been writing little novels ever since I was 8 years old. And so for me, like writing a book was the dream. And I had the opportunity to do it primarily because of the New York Times op-ed and all of the other work that I had done leading up to the op-ed. And then Penguin took a chance on me. It's kind of a big thing to have a creator, which is kind of what my job is. A lot of them are starting to write books.
Do you invest yourself in the market?
I do invest, yeah. So I dollar cost average into the S&P.
What's that mean?
So basically, I set aside a certain amount of money every month and invest into the SPY specifically, which is an ETF that tracks the S&P 500. This is not investment advice. It's just something that I think works for me and where I'm at.
And how often do you find people your age doing that, understanding how that works?
There's a lot of people my age who work in finance and who are investors and who are interested in investing. The rise of Robinhood really made a lot of people quite interested in this stuff. And so there's a few people I can talk to about it. And then, of course, I worked at a big asset manager right when I graduated school. And so I have friends from there who are quite interested. So yeah, it's a surprisingly high number of people, and even people who don't want to do it want to learn how, which I think is so great. So I'm always talking about markets and economics, which is really awesome.
Let's get to the important stuff in your book, the Taylor Swift tickets. What were you trying to explain?
A pop quiz about the book. I believe I was trying to explain supply and demand with that example. And so
Ticketmaster.
Yes, yeah. So Ticketmaster and price gouging. Yeah, so I believe that example in the book was about Taylor Swift tickets, and sort of this supply and demand. And so essentially, like everyone really loves Taylor Swift. She's a huge pop star, and her tickets go on sale, and everybody wants them. And so there's a massive amount of demand, but a quite limited amount of supply. And so there was a lawsuit, I believe, with Ticketmaster because Ticketmaster was ramping up the prices of these tickets because the supply was so limited and the demand was so high.
Should that be regulated?
I believe the FTC if they haven't gone after Ticketmaster yet, they're going to. Yeah, Lena Khan, who runs the FTC, is quite impressive in terms of the number of cases she's taking on. They just did click to cancel, where if you have a subscription, you should be able to cancel it the same way that you signed up. And so there should basically be a button. You don't have to call or be there in person. And so I do believe there should be some sort of suit against price gouging consumers. And I imagine the FTC will take that on if they haven't already.
Well, just for a moment, the fact is that Taylor Swift never has an empty seat in any of her concerts. So whatever the price is, they seem to be able to pay it. Isn't that supply and demand and just the way it works?
Yeah, no, a lot of people will say that about the concept of price gouging is that like, hey, people are willing to pay it. And I believe people paid on average $1,300 to experience Taylor Swift. And even with her Canada tour, you had US citizens like trying to get up there, going over to Europe. And so there was massive demand, and people were spending a ton of money on costumes, on hotels, on flights. And so there is kind of this weird, economic problem where it's like, well, how much do you let demand and supply influence? But I think she was upset personally about the price of the tickets, and that's kind of where it gets, less economically inclined.
The women's national basketball, the last game of the season between Indiana Fever and the Washington Mystics. I got online just to see what it would cost to go see Caitlin Clark and company. And there was one ticket at the bottom was $7,000.
Wow.
I don't know whether the guy got it or not, but yeah. I'm thinking to myself, that if it's a supply, they filled every seat.
Yeah.
Of course, that was probably resale.
Well, and that's good for the WNBA because I think they've had problems historically filling every seat. And I know that the rise of like Caitlin Clark and other star players has really helped the league. And so that's exciting to hear. But of course, yeah, you do have to have a conversation about like how expensive should these tickets be, especially if they're on the secondary market.
How about grandma's banana bread?
Yes.
What did you use that example?
So I believe I used that example as a way to talk about supply chains and the price of goods. And so with that, my grandma has been baking banana bread for a long time. And I talked specifically about the price of bananas and how expensive bananas have gotten. And then I believe I used the banana bread as another example of supply chains. So like where the bananas come from. I think the wheat, the sugar, etc. But basically, I do believe the primary example was the cost of banana bread over time and how expensive it's gotten relative to when she first started making banana bread.
One last one of these examples. I'm not sure you remember this one. The item on wine and what role the wine plays.
Oh yes, that the luxury good. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I believe I used a quote from somebody in that book. And the wine example was just talking about the study that talks about, how people they don't really know what the fancy wine is when they do a blind taste test, but they're willing to pay for a fancy label. And I believe that was the reason I talked about wine in the book.
Is there a favorite chapter that people go to in this book that you hear more about than others?
People really like the Federal Reserve chapter, and I think that's just because people really like the Federal Reserve. So there's been a lot of interest in that chapter, a lot of questions about that chapter, monetary policy too. There was also a lot of interest in the problems and opportunities chapters at the end of the book, where I talk about some of the problems that we're facing, getting into the attention economy, social media, and then the opportunities that we have, specifically discussing Derek Thompson's abundance agenda and how we can think about continuing to have a better life and what it would look like to really invest in various parts, including immigration, healthcare, education, green energy.
I want to go through some of that with you, but it seemed to me as I was reading that, I got this feeling that this is going to cost a lot of money.
The abundance agenda, yeah. And it's kind of, and a lot of people disagree with the stance that I have on debt, which is as long as it's productive, I do think it's okay. And okay being relative, like I still think there needs to be an element of fiscal conservativeness. I believe that's the correct word. But fiscal austerity, let's say. So yeah, the abundance agenda is developed by Derek Thompson, and it's focused on healthcare. It's focused on green energy, like I said, education, high-skilled immigration, and just sort of investing. So spending money on green energy, spending money on building more housing, spending money on education, spending money on resilient climate infrastructure. And the goal with all of that is to hedge against certain futures, like we just saw with the two hurricanes that have devastated North Carolina and Florida. If we had invested in climate resilient infrastructure, it might have been a different story, and green energy, et cetera, all the same sort of idea, just hedging against kind of the future that we seem to be heading to.
Anybody that runs a business would probably swallow hard on this particular paragraph from your book. And I want to get your reaction to that.
Sure.
The World Health Organization recommends breastfeeding for 6 months, which is probably an argument for at least 6 months of maternity leave.
Mm-hmm.
Really? 6 months for maternity leave?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of mothers, it's important to spend time with your children. There's not blanket maternity leave at this point, and that's an important thing, especially if we think about the demographic situation in the United States. I believe it's 25% of Americans are going to be over 65 by the age of 2030. And if we want to have a workforce that can support an aging population, we're going to have to give people the ability to have children and to care for those children. And so I do think investing in the family unit, investing in maternity leave, paternity leave as well, is the way that we fix the demographic crisis that we are headed toward. So maybe it doesn't need to be 6 months, but it probably needs to be more instated than it is currently.
One of the things no one ever talks about is the individual responsibility of choice. And in other words, is there an unlimited number of children you should be allowed to have and still be in the workforce?
So you can have like 9 kids and still work? Is that what you mean?
Well, the point is that here you're in a business and it costs a lot of money for a company. Let's say somebody makes $150,000 a year and you're out 6 months, that's 75 grand you're missing that you have to fill in some way or another. And you're trying to run a business, but families could just go on and have 3, 4, and 5 children. But did they have any responsibility to have the children that they can afford?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the goal that most families set out with, is like making sure, and that's kind of why millennials aren't having kids, is because a lot of people are worried about the cost of childcare, which is up 32% since 2019. Right. And so I think that is definitely something a lot of people consider, is this responsibility of a child and how much it does cost. I would say that this current generation is quite cognizant of that, to the point of paralysis. So I'm not sure if there should be some sort of company rule on the number of children that you have. I imagine at a certain point for a mother, it might make more, or a father, whoever, it might make more sense to stay at home with the kids if you're choosing to have a lot at one time. But of course, that is the individual's responsibility, and perhaps a conversation between the employee and the employer.
What do you think the rules ought to be on how many days a week you have to come into the office?
I think, again, that just depends on the company. I know a lot of people benefit greatly from in-person work. I graduated into the pandemic and was in the office for like 3 or 4 months before the pandemic hit. And so I never really got to experience the in-office opportunity outside of the internships that I held selling cars and working at a local asset manager. But when I was in the office, it was quite beneficial. But I know some people prefer to work remotely. And there's several studies saying that remote workers are more productive. There's less stress, but of course, more collaboration at the work spot is something that you can't really replicate via Zoom. There's a lot you can't replicate via Zoom. So
you grew up in Louisville. What were your parents like? I assume they're still with us. And what do they do?
Yeah, my parents are still here. They work, my mother works in insurance, and my father used to work at General Electric, and now he actually trades options via a company called JC Trade. That's what he uses to do that, and it's quite cool. And yeah, they're great. They're triathletes. They're very hardcore.
Did you say you sold cars?
I did sell cars, yes, when I was 19.
Give us that experience. What should we know as car buyers? What the person on the other side is thinking when you walk in to buy a car?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's two things that experience. The first is that there's always a markup. I think everybody already knows that. And the margin has sort of been eroded because of things like Kelley Blue Book. You can go in and have a pretty good idea of what a car is worth. And as a car salesperson, there really isn't much you can do when they bring out the Kelley Blue Book, which is the price of the car according to that company. So yeah, that's kind of it. You're just sort of a liaison between the person who wants to buy a car and the manager. I would say that be careful in the finance office. That's usually when they try to attach you to like massive warranties and upsell you on a lot of different financing options. I'd say also like be really careful on the loan that you take out. I unfortunately sold a couple of 84-month loans in a car as a depreciating asset. So you really don't want to be beholden to that for a very long time. 84 months is a long time. And also, of course, just be mindful of your credit score, because that's really when the financing terms can get quite uncomfortable, as if your credit score is low. So,
What should we know about credit scores?
oh, I mean, that's just like paying off your credit cards on time, making sure you don't have a high revolving amount, so that, making sure that you pay it down. You're not holding a high balance on the credit card. There's tricks like having a couple of credit cards for various things. Like I have a credit card for the grocery store, for Amazon purchases, and then for my travel. And that tends to be, I think, a good thing to do with credit cards. But there are actually a lot of hacks on credit cards that if you choose to do so, you can look it up online and learn more than I could tell you in a few minutes.
Why should people be penalized who do not have credit cards, use debit cards, and have no debt, and then have a lousy credit score?
I know. I think that's quite sad. Like the credit score is the social signifier of ability, right? And like if you come in with cash, it's fine. Like you can buy a house in cash, you can buy a car in cash, and it's less of an issue, I believe. But yeah, the credit score situation in the United States is something quite interesting and probably deserves again a much longer conversation. But I don't think they should be penalized, but it's just kind of a marker of trust in the financial system, and that they trust you. And if you don't have one, the trust isn't marked, for better or for worse.
You did say your mother's in insurance?
Mm-hmm.
So this line from your book, I wonder what she thinks of this line from your book.
Yes.
We need to rethink how private insurance functions.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah, so I think that line specifically, if it wasn't referring to the concept of home insurance, it should have been in flood insurance, all of that stuff. And I think just in general, home insurance has to be, or just insurance in general, has to be kind of rethought, both in regards to health insurance, home insurance, as I mentioned. Home insurance specifically is quite interesting because you have a lot of states where insurers have entirely pulled out, like Florida and California. And so the only person that can really step in is the government, with like citizens insurance in Florida, for example. And that makes it very difficult for the people who have achieved the quote unquote American dream in those places, because all of a sudden you have a house and you can't insure it. And you have to have insurance if you have a mortgage. If you pay cash, no problem, you can self-insure. But for a lot of people, private insurance has failed them in a big way. When we talk about home insurance, I think health insurance is a whole other issue that I honestly don't know enough to even begin to comment on. But I can say with home insurance specifically, we do really need to think private insurance and how it fits.
How did you protect yourself as you're writing this book for not having misinformation or misinterpretation of something that you're writing about?
I had a lot of readers read it. I had people who are tough critics of my ideas, people who I disagree with, people who disagree with me, and I had them read the book. So there was probably about 10 people in total that read the novel, and I think any of them would have caught misinformation and disinformation. My opinion does leak in, especially toward the end of the book, but I try to remain objective, at least in the first 18 chapters. So.
Here's a thing that you said, we need to offer, these are your words, public education to pre-K students, ensure after-school alternatives, and raising the pay of child care workers.
Mm-hmm.
Other than saying we need to do that, where's the money coming from?
Yeah, no, that seems to be a popular question. Yes, so I mean, I think the reason that I stated that was because of what we were talking about earlier with the demographic crisis. I think the only way that we fix that is through immigration or through helping people have children if they choose to do so. And so childcare workers are paid quite low. There's probably room to pay them more. The problem is that childcare facilities have quite low margins because of a regulatory overhead. And of course, you're dealing with children. There has to be a lot of regulations in place. But a lot of childcare facilities have had to close down just because of the regulatory burden and the number of workers that are required per child, the number of facilities that have to be on hand. And so I think expanding childcare or increasing childcare wages would be really helpful because it would introduce more people into the space and help take care of the next generation. I think that's the most important thing. And there's care bonds that could be issued where it's quite interesting, actually. Like private credit is becoming a very big thing, and they're buying up all sorts of financing instruments, including an instrument to help finance a dividend for a company that basically will never make money ever and is actually losing a lot of money. And so I think the idea behind care bonds is to take some of the money that is exploding in private credit and help finance childcare worker wages, help finance the expansion of after school programs. I attended after school programs because my parents had to work, right? And we have to take care of the kids who are in those sorts of situations and the parents who need that and can't afford a babysitter. And so I think it's just that sort of stuff where we have to take care of the next generation, as I've said a couple of times. And one way to do that is through care bonds.
What did your parents think of your book?
They disagreed with some parts of it. Yeah, I think they're both pretty fiscally conservative. And again, they had sort of similar questions that you're asking me. How do we pay for these things? And my answer, of course, is, just investing in the next generation and it'll pay for itself over time. There's different financing instruments that we can use, like care bonds. But yeah, they thought the book was quite interesting, and I think are proud of me. So yeah.
I laughed at this line, not for any particular reason, but just trying to figure out all the language of finance.
Sure.
And you can explain it. A common practice is using interest rates, which involves swapping interest rates.
And
that goes back to all those credit default swaps and all that stuff, the gibberish of the 2008 years and the subprime and all that. How much of a bamboozle was that era?
2008?
From the banks or from the banks and the investment groups and all that stuff. I mean, the average person had no idea what they're talking about.
No, during that time, absolutely not. And I don't think the banks quite knew what was happening. I was quite young, so I wasn't there for it. I remember the impact that it had on my family. But I mean, I think for a lot of people, it was just essentially banks doing a lot of funny financing things. And we're sort of seeing stuff like that begin to pop up again, like what I was talking about with private credit and them investing in these opportunities that are never, ever going to probably pay anything. And for the banks during that time, they were doing something a little bit similar where they were investing in sort of just toxic instruments. And when you invest in a toxic instrument, you're going to lose money eventually. Like something is going to blow up. And so that's what happened during 2008. And I think that's the concern with some of the things that we're seeing now. Like we already saw Silicon Valley Bank blow up for various reasons. And there's always stuff like that brewing.
You say many of us have witnessed the American dream rot, R-O-T, before our eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So that passage specifically, the context of the American dream, the way that I see it, and I think the way that other people see it, is buying a home, having a family, having a 9-to-5, perhaps, just a more structural lifestyle, and having the finances to afford a home, to afford children. And what I meant by rot is that homes are quite expensive. It's not as easy to get one in the places where people want to live as it used to be for various reasons, primarily because we have not built enough in the places where people want to live, especially in places like California. And it's made the American dream seem increasingly impossible. Boomers still own most of the 3 and 4 bedroom homes, when at this point it probably should have passed on to millennials so they can have children and raise families. Millennials are starting to buy up homes. Their home ownership rate is increasing. Their wealth is increasing. They're doing okay. But the American dream is just not what it used to be, primarily because of this home ownership issue.
Where do you go for truth?
I primarily go for truth in fiction novels. So I read a lot of Kurt Vonnegut. I read a lot of Octavia Butler. I read a lot of the classics, and James Baldwin. And, all of those are fiction. So you think like they're not true, but you do find a lot of truth in those stories. And I think that that is like the easiest way to convey truth is through a story versus like trying to talk about it directly. And so that's where I go for truth. I don't know if that's the answer you're looking for. I don't know if there's really a news source that you can say is totally unbiased. A place called Semaphore tries to do it, where they'll tell a story and then talk about the reporter's opinion on the story to try and get to that, sole source of truth. But I think it's just difficult right now because we have so much information and nobody knows how to sift through all of it.
I know this is stepping on an organization, not stepping on it, but mentioning an organization that you work for. But what's your feeling about Mr. Bloomberg's worth over $50 billion, supposedly, and he owns an organization called Bloomberg News? And do you trust that? Is that trustworthy? And do you get any sense of his involvement? We've seen all these big moguls, whether it's Murdoch or you can name them, Jeff Bezos. Yeah, I mean, how do you trust them, and when do you not trust them?
Yeah, so Bloomberg, the company, I work for Bloomberg Opinion, so it's actually separate than Bloomberg News. But Bloomberg, the company, is interesting because the primary product is the terminal. Like the news organization isn't the primary product. Like this terminal, which is this very expensive product that they sell to finance shops, is actually how they make all of their money. So the news itself, I think they do a pretty good job. I don't agree with some of their takes. Like they've gotten, lambasted for this, but their economist team the economics team a few years ago basically published a paper saying that we had a 100% chance of a recession by the end of 2022. And I think that is not true. That did not happen. That is not a good thing to report on. And so I really think you just have to cross compare as best you can. I think it's difficult when billionaire money enters the chat, but that's just how it is. Billionaires have a lot of money. They're going to buy up assets and they're going to diversify the assets that they have. It's a conversation that's a little bit higher than my pay grade to figure out if they should be able to do that. Like, should Elon Musk have been able to buy Twitter? I don't know. And that's really something that we probably need to have a chat about the government needs to have a chat about, because I think it definitely can skew the truth, as you said.
Here's a strong statement from you in your book. Everyone knows our healthcare system is abysmal.
Yes.
Does everybody know that?
I think most people do. Yeah. My dad had
What
stage
does it
4.
mean?
My
Go
dad had
ahead.
stage 4 stomach cancer. And it was very difficult for him to get treatment and very difficult to get into special treatment programs. Luckily, he's okay. Everything was taken care of. He had a great doctor, but it's extraordinarily expensive. It's quite difficult to get specialized care, and it's really scary. I was hit by a car a few weeks ago on my bike, and it was really difficult to get into a dentist. It was kind of a long line, urgent care. And so I think that's really the thing, is like maybe different things or different services are not offered at the speed that they might need to be. I know a friend who, and this is all anecdotes, but I know a friend whose mother desperately needs chemotherapy and is on a waiting list for a certain type of it. And so I think that's the thing. It's the healthcare facilities. The doctors do the best that they can with the things that they have, with the resources that they have. The nurses do the best that they can, but it's kind of like the college situation that we were talking about earlier. There's a lot of administrative overhead. There's a lot of paperwork that's put on the doctors. The insurance programs are massively confusing. And so I think a lot of people are aware of the abysmal nature of US healthcare. We still have very good doctors and we still have good institutions, but getting care when you need it can be really difficult sometimes. And I just think as the richest country in the world, it shouldn't be that way.
You talk about the endowment for the universities, and you mentioned primarily Harvard, which does have 50 billion plus in their endowment, but the average is in the millions, low millions. And is there enough money there to really, in the endowments, to take care of the tuition?
I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of people have proposed that. I think college tuition has run away. um, Probably doesn't need to be as expensive as it is. And I think that's a conversation that the schools need to have. And also, we need to talk about the return on investment of various degrees. It's unfortunate that it's very difficult to get a job with some of the degrees that people choose to get, but they're still paying massive amounts in student loans, even though the job opportunity is not guaranteed by the university. So I'm not sure if they should use their endowments to pay off student tuition. I think it really should be a conversation about the cause, not the symptom, which is student tuition is a little too high in general. And why is it too high is because of the various services. Like college is becoming a massive game, and you have people making millions of dollars a year tutoring students so they can get into college, and running various programs that cost a lot of money so people can get into schools, highly selective schools. And so the whole thing we've kind of forgotten that it's about education, I think.
Optimistic, pessimistic for you?
Am I an optimist or a pessimist?
Yeah.
It depends on the day. I tend trend towards optimism most of the time. I think that if we've figured it out for this long, we can continue to figure it out. I think that the money is in the wrong places right now, and that worries me. I think that there's a lot of money wrapped up in big tech companies who I'm not sure if they're using it for the best of humanity, but also that's a value judgment on what's best for people. And perhaps I'm not the right person to be making that value judgment, but I'm optimistic on people. I think people are wonderful if we give them the chance to do it, to be wonderful.
What do you think of 1% having 40% of the money in this country?
I don't think anybody would think that's a great thing except for the 1%. I'm a big fan, if that hasn't, come across in the conversation, of redistribution of not redistribution, but reallocation, higher taxes on the 1%. I know that's unpopular with the said 1%, and that some of them are doing everything they can to not pay higher taxes. But I don't know. I think that we really have to think as a country, and the 1%, because of the runaway wealth, they tend to kind of like live in a whole different universe than everybody else. And that makes them not want to pay taxes and not participate in a big way. And I just would love to see like more Andrew Carnegie's, what he did at the end of his life, building libraries. We don't really have a lot of billionaires like that. We have some, but they could do a lot more for society than they have been doing.
Have you had an opportunity in your writing and your advising to be inside the billionaire world?
I've met a couple of them. It's not quite often. I spend a lot more time with policymakers, a lot more time with academics. So I haven't spent a lot of time with billionaires, but I've met several venture capitalists and I've met several tech founders, but not a lot of time.
But a lot of academics resent the fact that the billionaires have the money, and the billionaires look at the academics and say, if you wanted the money, you should have gotten in the business. So how do you divide that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think you could say that about a lot of stuff, is if you wanted it, just go and do it. And there's ethical concerns that I think some of the academics might cite for not doing certain things. But what the billionaires were very good at was operating in the constraints of whatever industry they were in, and they figured out how to exploit it, right? And that's what the US is all about, is exploiting constraints, and they did a very good job at it. And but there's a whole conversation to be had about that.
This book is In This Economy with a question mark after it. How'd you get to that title?
So In This Economy is kind of a meme online. So people, which you haven't seen because you're not on social media, but people would be like, in this economy, like, and refer to going to a movie or, like hanging out with somebody, or just in general, like a funny sort of line. At least a few years ago, it was a funny line. So yeah, it's just a funny way to say something.
I have to say, though, in reading your book, even though I'm not on social media, I didn't get a sense that you were writing for somebody only on social media.
I'm not. No, I'm not. The book is, as I said, for anybody who wants to understand the economy. The title just happens to be from the internet. But yeah, the book, I hope, doesn't sound like it's made for somebody on social media. That was not my goal in writing it.
What's your next step? Another book?
Yeah, so the another book. The book, yes, I'm wrapping up the book tour. I've been on the road every week since it came out, which has been quite new for me. I'm seeing places I never thought I would see in my whole life, which is quite cool. I never thought I'd really leave Kentucky. And the next step is just figuring out how I can teach people. I really just am so passionate about educating people about the economy. I don't know if another book will be the right answer, but if it is, always open to the opportunity. We're really just focusing on honing in the skills needed to help people understand the world around them.
We're wrapping it up, but I got to ask you, the book is dedicated to Mom, Dad, Ryan, and Moo. Who's Moo?
Moo is my dog, yeah. Moo is my puppy. She's a boxer mix.
Who is Ryan?
Ryan is my brother. Yeah, he's my little brother.
How old is he?
He is 25. Yes, he works for Kroger Corporate in Cincinnati, and he's wonderful. He's my best friend.
So, if all the activity you've had and the tour and all, what has come back to you the most? In other words, what has been the most effective way to communicate, including the book? But
social media videos. Yeah. Really,
media videos.
Social media. Yeah. So posting on TikTok and Instagram, that seems to be that's where people are. And you can just reach millions of people in those places that when I go to universities, I can reach a room of 200, or if I'm at a conference, a room of 2,000. But on social media, 20,000, 200,000, 2 million people will see a video. And so that is the most effective form of reaching people right now. And it is where people go to learn and to do a lot of other stuff, but mainly to learn. And so that is something I'm trying to figure out. Yes.
Kyla Scanlon, the book is In This Economy? How money markets really work. Thank you much.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Thanks for listening to the Booknotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review Booknotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.